Copyright in these lectures is either owned by the ANU or a third party who has licensed the ANU to use it. Students may use the recording for personal study only. No lecture may be communicated online, copied or shared without the prior permission of the ANU.
All right, welcome back, everyone. Ooh, it was loud. Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be, so for lecture 11, today we're going to be doing not what the slide says, because the slide is apparently an old one and not correct. We're going to be doing money, inflation, and short-run fluctuations. We're going to be, I've decided to push trade to next week. I was thinking of moving things around and putting trade at the end of today, but I've decided instead to talk about trade as its own thing next week, and this week we're going to be doing money, inflation, and short-run fluctuations. Not trade. For admin-y things, what's the title on that? So as I say, money, inflation, short-run fluctuations, I will talk a little bit about exam revision information, because the final exam is in 2 weeks. That's terrifying. Sorry, I never thought of it that way before. The final exam is in 2 weeks, so be aware of that. So I'll talk a little bit about some exam revision stuff as well. If we have time at the end, we had exam viewing yesterday. We have it also today and tomorrow. We had some exam viewing yesterday, and there were 2 questions in particular that quite a few students were asking about. And so if we have time at the end of today, I will talk about those 2. I suspect we will. There's not all that much to talk about today, but we'll see how we go. If we have time today, I'll talk about question A5 and B2 a little bit. Just as the quick admin things, personal projects should all be in by now. I think there's 1 person who's received an extension on the personal project, so otherwise they should all be in by now. Problem set 2 is due tomorrow at 11:55. It's about half the length of problem set 1, because I received feedback that problem set 1 was too long, so it's about half the length. There should be 2 part A questions and 1 part B question. Yes? PM. Should be. It should be PM. If it's not PM, then it should be PM. I'll fix it to make it PM. Does it say 11:55 a.m.? Do you know if it says 11:50? No, okay. I'm pretty sure it's PM. It's meant to be PM. As always, I encourage you to try and have it done by 5, so that you can upload it and not have to waste your entire Friday evening working on this, but it's up to you. Exam viewing is ongoing. As I say, we had some exam viewing yesterday for about 3 hours. We have exam viewing today for 2 hours. We have exam viewing tomorrow for 1 hour. The details on times and locations are available on Wattle if you want to have a look there. Yes, last piece of admin is next week. In addition to the talk on trade, because I will talk about trade next week, we will also have an exam revision session. For this is where you ask me questions about stuff that you'd like me to talk about, and then I talk about it. The way to ask questions is to go to the discussion forum and go to the final exam revision post and post questions you have there. This is so that I have time to reflect on them and construct, appropriate solutions. Depending on how many questions go here, I might take questions from the floor, but I really would prefer to have questions here so that I can produce, so I can work through solutions before, and I'm not just speaking off the cuff during the lecture. I'm okay with speaking off the cuff if I have to, but I prefer not to. Yes. Yep.
The purpose of exam viewing is just to see where you read wrong, or is it also if there's some issue that's not too sure about the marking?
Yep. It's both, yes. There's not negotiation per se. So for exam viewing, there's as I say, there's two core reasons why you might want to go to exam viewing. One is so that you can figure out what you did wrong, right? So you can say, oh, this question, I thought I understood this, but actually it turns out I didn't understand it at all, and I have to go away and figure it out. As I say, this is still really helpful here, because knowing more stuff is good. It's much more important. This is for the rest of your university career. It's much more important in your other courses. It's still important here, but it's really, really vital that you do this, these for your exams, for this reason, in all your other courses, right? A lot of students don't, but, you know, what's the point of sitting a 3-hour exam and then getting a mark back of 60 out of 100 and going, yeah, that's all right. You may as well go in and look at your exam and be like, okay, well, I understood this part and I didn't understand that part, so I should revise that part a lot more so that when it comes up in the final, I don't also get 2 out of 10, right? But that's not so important here because the course is so split, because it's such a microeconomics course and a macroeconomics course. It's still helpful, but it's not as helpful. The other part is scrounging for marks, or noticing where the lecturer or tutor has marked incorrectly. Either way, depending on how you want to view it. Basically, if you go through and you think that the question has been marked incorrectly, then you can fill out a form that says, I got 2 out of 10 for this question, but I answered it correctly and I covered this and this point, and so I think I should have gotten 7. Or, so I think I should have gotten a different mark. And then that question is then remarked. You need to be aware when remarking that the mark can go up or down. It usually doesn't change, but when it changes, it usually goes up. But I have personally, and I have seen others, reduce marks from remarking. The student comes in with a 7 out of 10 and says, oh, I think I did really well, and you read it and you go, no, you did real bad. You should have gotten like 4, and then you give them 4, because they should have gotten 4. So you need to be a little bit careful. The mark can go down. It doesn't usually, but it can happen. Does that address your question? Excellent. Yes, admin questions, yes? Yep.
I'm very curious about the difficulty about the final exam. Is the difficulty similar with the written?
The difficulty will be the difficulty of the final exam was the question. The difficulty will be targeted to be broadly similar. That said, I'm a microeconomist, not a macroeconomist. And so I'm more likely to ask easier questions in a macro exam. I will be targeting the final to be of a similar difficulty level, but I suspect that will end up meaning that it'll be slightly easier. The other part I need to that's a lot. Anyway, the other part is for part B, it will just be 2 questions for part B, not pick 2 of 3. There was a revolt from the tutors, so it has 2 questions, not 2 of 3 questions for the final, for the part B of the final. Yes. I suppose I will put solution outlines up for problem set 2. So not full solutions, not like 10 out of 10 solutions, but answers, I guess you might say, if that makes sense. Otherwise, any questions? Just because making 10 out of 10 solutions is very time consuming, so I'll make sample solutions. I can have a look through and what I'll do is I'll try and find people who have done really well in it, and I'll get their permission to post their solutions. For problem set 2. Any questions? Any other? Sorry, that's all I really have to say about admin stuff. Are there any? We've had some admin questions, but are there any further admin issues? Yes.
We thought that the first exam was very long, like almost 3 hours. Do you expect this one to be just as long in terms of number of questions?
I would anticipate this exam to be exactly as long as the previous. It'll still be six part A's, 2 part B's. Otherwise, any questions, concerns? Okay. In that case, let's talk about money, inflation, and short-run fluctuations. So we've talked about some of these things a little bit in the past, and we've been talking about them in a new way and thinking about them in a new way. We started off last week about talking about money. We did about 5 minutes of money last week. So just to reiterate, so money is a set of assets in an economy which people use to buy goods and services from other people or firms. And again, we talk about the 3 core functions: medium of exchange, which is our double coincidence of wants problem, right? If we don't have money for us to trade, I have to have something you want, and you have to have something I want. And the point of money is that because we both have money, we both definitely have something the other person wants. And so you can give me money, and I can give you lecturing services. Rather than me giving lecturing services and you giving me bushels of wheat, which I don't really want because I can't use bushels of wheat, or loaves of bread, which I do want, I suppose, but anyway. We also need money to act as a unit of account. It's really handy to have something act as a unit of account. You don't need all three of these in the same thing, but it is helpful to have them all in the same thing. So we need a unit of account. This is to say, when I go and buy something, I can buy bread that costs $1, or I can buy milk that costs $2, and I know very quickly that milk costs twice as much as bread. Right? 2 litres of milk costs twice as much as a loaf of bread. I buy very cheap bread. So a unit of account, which makes comparison easier, and a store of value, right? We need something that doesn't go off. We don't want to use loaves of bread. We might use wheat. Wheat stays for quite a while. We don't want to use something like loaves of bread because they lose value over time. So we need something that doesn't decay over time, because otherwise you can't use it to save money, So anything with these properties is money, and again, we talk about commodity money versus fiat money. So commodity money is stuff that used to be used, gold, silver, cigarettes in prisons and stuff, when you can't use other money. Those cigarettes are also banned now, so they now use chewing gum, I think. They use something else now instead as money. But mostly what we use as money now is what we call fiat money, and so all of our analysis is going to be assuming we're working in a world with fiat money, because we are working in a world with fiat money. So fiat money is where the government just has cash and it says, this money is valuable, and you have to believe them. And the money continues to have value because everyone believes it has value, and for no other reason. This is not dissimilar to something like gold, right? Gold has some scarcity value, but mostly gold has value because other people think it has value, right? It's not that useful on its own. It's only useful because other people will take it. Fiat money is the same way. It's useful because other people will take it. Government-backed fiat money, so actual fiat money like Australian dollars, also gains benefit because the government can demand that you pay them your debts to them which is taxation, in the fiat money. This is one of the ways you introduce fiat money and get people to start treating it as money, is that the government accepts it as payment. When the government accepts or indeed requires it as payment, the government says you must pay your taxes in Australian dollars. Then Australian dollars have value, which means people will accept them as currency. Cryptocurrencies are, I say, the new thing. I put them as part of fiat money. Some people put them as their own category because they're not government-backed at all, right? This is things like Bitcoin or the various other ones. Ethereum is the other big one, which are online currencies, which only have value because people think they have value, but which are not government-backed, is the distinction. But yeah. Any issues on what we talked about last week as what we think of as being money, things that we think of as being money? All this is fine. We're then going to dump all of this and talk about Australian dollars, because we are. Okay. In that case, we can move on and talk about central banks and monetary policy a little bit. So most countries, I think all countries really have what we call a central bank. So a central bank is an institution that's there basically to make sure that the banking system, the money system, and oversee the banking system or financial system, and to do so usually in some way to make sure that the financial condition of the economy holds up, to make sure that the financial side of the economy works properly, that you have banks, that banks can trade between themselves, that banks operate correctly, that we have money, that the money that we have, that they set monetary policy, so they print the money more or less. And they do a few other things as well. They have targets that they aim for. They usually, in Australia, they aim for inflation targets. In the US, I believe they have a dual mandate still, so they aim for an inflation target and an employment target. They do a few different things. In our era, right, in the current time, the central bank is usually a public entity, which is not entirely exact, but it's usually a public entity, and it's usually separate from the government. Both of those things are what usually happens now, but are not necessarily historical accidents. They're the best way of doing things, I would say, but they're not the only way of doing things. You can have central banks that are private. The Bank of England is more or less government run now, but the Bank of England was a private entity before it was a largely private entity before it was a public central bank. In the US, the Federal Reserve is made up of lots of different, not federal government-owned entities. Each Federal Reserve is its own little thing in different states and different places, and they come together to make the Federal Reserve. So it's strange. They don't have to be separate from the government. Indeed, central banks were not separate from the government until fairly recently. So splitting off the central bank, giving the central bank independence is something we really, really like, we really, really want, but it's something that didn't happen until the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Right? Before that, the central bank was just part of the government. The government decided monetary policy, the government decided how much money to print, and you get problems like hyperinflation. In certain countries, in certain places, you're getting hyperinflation because the government decides to print lots of money. In Australia now, that can't happen because the government doesn't control monetary policy. The government doesn't get to decide how much money to print because the central bank is independent. Similarly in the US, similarly in Britain. So say in Australia, we have the thing we call it the central bank, we call the Reserve Bank of Australia. Different countries have different names. But this formulates and administers monetary policy and tries to maintain stability of the payments system, of the financial system as a whole. This is what central banks are there to try and do. Any questions, issues, problems? Oh, okay. Sure. In most of the world, we use a process called fractional reserve banking. Again, it's not the only way of doing things, but it is very, very much the standard way of doing things at the moment. So in fractional reserve banking is that the money supply is we think about money, when we think about the money supply, the amount of money out there, it's affected by the amount deposited in banks and the amount that banks loan out. Right? When we think about deposits, deposits are two things. When I deposit money in a bank, that becomes an asset. From the bank's perspective, that is an asset because they get the money, but it's also a liability because they now owe me the money, right? From the bank's perspective. For the bank, when I give the money, they have the money, which is great for them, but they owe the money to a depositor, to me. Loans from the bank are just assets to the bank, right? When the bank loans out money, the bank now owns a loan, and a loan is a type of asset for the bank. Right? The way banks work, to a certain extent, is they take in money deposits, and then they give that money back out afterwards as loans. This is how banks operate. They take in money, they get your money as a depositor, and you give it to them because they offer you, 3% interest, which is better than your 0% interest when you just hold cash. And then they loan it out to people at 4 or 5% interest. So they can make money out of that in that way. So this is how banking works, shockingly. What we have in Australia, and again in most of the world, is fractional reserve banking. So from the bank's perspective, when they take money in, they can do two things with it. They can either keep it, and if they keep it, we call it reserves, right? Deposits that are not loaned out, or they loan it out, and it becomes a loan. In a fractional reserve system, the bank is legally required usually, to hold some fraction of its deposits as reserves. This amount has been increased recently. It's generally an international recommendation under the Basel recommendations. So we're at Basel. I think we're at Basel III now. I think Basel III either just came in or is about to come in, which is a series of bank regulations, one of which says how much reserve they have to hold. And it's about 8% or 10%, or around about that level at the moment. The bank has to hold 10% of their deposits as reserves, and they will generally choose to lend out the rest because by lending money out, they can make money by lending it out. Right? The way the bank makes money is by giving you cash and charging you 10% interest. So the reserve ratio is this 10% number. It's the fraction of deposits that are required to be reserves. And we'll run through how this creates money in the next slides. Any questions? Questions, problems, concerns? Who's heard of fractional reserve banking before? A couple there. Not that many. Okay, cool. As I say, the reason why we call this fractional reserve banking is because we have banks that are keeping reserves, and they're keeping a fraction of their deposits as reserves. So we get fractional reserve banking. So when we think about the way this creates money, is suppose we have $100 in the economy, which is held by Anne. And Anne takes $100 and deposits it in a bank, because otherwise she's just holding cash, which isn't doing anything for her. And we're going to think about a reserve ratio of 10%, because it makes the numbers easier. So currently there's $100 in the economy. The bank takes that $100, it puts $10 in reserve, because it's required to, and then it takes that $90 and lends it out to someone else. It takes that $90 and lends it out to Bob. Right? Bob now has $90. And Bob goes to a bank and takes his $90 that he's borrowed from that he's got and puts it in a bank somewhere, puts it in a different bank. Yeah? And so Bob takes the $90, puts it in a bank somewhere. Well, there's now $190 in the economy. Right? Anne is sitting there. Anne is thinking, this is great. I have $100 in my bank account. I'm feeling really good because I have $100. Bob's sitting there thinking, I have $90 cash in my hand. I have $90. I'm feeling really good. So there's $190 in the economy. As I say, Bob puts the $90 in a bank account. The bank, again, reserves. I spelled that wrong. Yeah, that's fine. The bank reserves reserves 10%. And it lends out $81 to Qingyan, which is not spelled that way at all. It's lent out to Qingyan. And so now there's the $100 in Anne's bank account, $90 in Bob's bank account, and the $81 in Qingyan's bank account, in Qingyan's hand. So there's $271 in the economy. And we keep going down this process. The bank reserves some money, the bank lends out the rest. Yes. And so on, right? And so on forever. And so we end up with more money in the economy than the initial amount that we started with because we keep lending it out. And we only reserve 10% and we lend out the rest. And so we create money. When one bank loans out money, it becomes deposits to another bank, which creates more deposits, which creates more loans, which creates more deposits, creates more loans. However, because we're reserving 10% each time, this process doesn't mean that we end up with infinite amounts of money. Because, again, we're reserving that 10%. And so when you do a little bit of mathematics, you do a little bit of geometric series, summing of geometric series, you find that we get a money multiplier, which works out to be the reciprocal of the reserve ratio. So the money multiplier here I've given as M, reserve ratio is R. So the money multiplier, so for example, if I have a reserve ratio of 5%, then when I had $100 to start with in the economy, I would expect after the banking system does its thing, there would be $2,000 in the economy. Again, if I had a reserve ratio of 10%, then that $100 would become $1,000. So this is the process of money creation through a money multiplier effect. It's something you need to be aware of. It's not something we're going to work with, not something we're going to work with a whole lot, but it's something you should be aware of at least. Any issues, questions? Yep. That's an interesting question. The question was, what if I want my money back the next day? So there's two answers: the good answer and the real bad, and the really bad answer, and the okay answer, I guess. The good answer is there's lots of people. I've done this as Anne starts with all the money in the world, but that's not really how this works. Right? Well, how this works is there's 1,000 people, each of whom have $100, all of whom deposit their $100, and then it spreads through the economy, and we get the money multiplier happening. And so the bank so while I've deposited $100, the bank is going to be holding in reserve, $10,000 from lots of different people. So when I go to the bank and take out my $100, the bank just uses its reserves to pay me. So this is fine. This is the answer when things are going fine. When things go badly, you get what you used to get. You don't so much anymore, but you used to get, particularly in the 19th century, in the late 19th century, but it's still, and early 20th century, but it is still an issue. It can still be an issue, is you get a bank run. Is I take my money out, and that's fine, but then you go, is the bank going to be able to pay everyone? And so you go to the bank and take your money out. And then the next person goes, lots of people are taking money out of the bank. Maybe the bank won't have enough reserves to pay everyone. And then everyone rushes the bank to try to get their cash out as fast as they can. We call this a bank run, and it is a problem. It's a known problem. It's largely solved in Australia. It's not a problem in Australia because one of the things the central bank does is the central bank guarantees deposits. What I mean by that is bank runs can't happen in Australia because if you go to the bank and want to take money out, and you can't because everyone else has already taken out all the reserves from the bank, then the central bank will step in and give you your money back. The central bank will force your local bank to borrow money from the central bank to pay you. So the loans are guaranteed. So the deposits are guaranteed by the central bank, which gets around this problem. So that's the good answer. The good thing that happens is it's fine because only one person at a time takes money out and nothing goes too badly wrong. If lots of people try and take money out at the same time, and you don't have the kind of protections we do in Australia, you can get a bank run and things go terribly, terribly wrong. I think there was a bank run in Cyprus a few years ago. They happen from time to time. But in a place like Australia, the central bank guarantees deposits. And so it basically can't happen here. If everyone in the entire economy tried to do it all at the same time, there probably would be an issue because even the central bank then would struggle to deal with this, but that doesn't happen. Yes? There may be a cap per person. I'm not actually... Is there now? Okay, well then, yes, then within certain limitations then. Is it 200? Okay. There's a cap of, apparently, there's a cap of $200,000 per person, I would assume, yeah, for deposits, for the deposit guarantee. So you can take your money out of the bank, but if you are the kind of person that has $1 million in deposits, then you could, in principle, be affected by a bank run. But it's also that's probably not, so a $200,000 limit is probably not going to be binding in most cases. It's going to be pretty rare that an individual has more than $200,000 in cash, right? Lots of people have more than $200,000 of assets, but it'll very rarely be just cash in the bank. Okay. Did that answer your question? No. Okay. Yep. Yep. No, to a certain extent. The question was, is the reserve ratio, who determines the reserve ratio, or how is the reserve ratio determined? The reserve ratio is determined, is recommended internationally by this group in Basel. As I say, we're on Basel III now. I think we're on Basel III now. And they say, you must use this reserve ratio. And so that's what you use. You can require a higher reserve ratio if you like in the economy, but I believe in order to access lots of international banking stuff, your country has to have at least the requirement number by Basel III. So everyone just uses that, basically. And I cannot recall what the actual number is at the moment. I think it's around 7%, but I could be mistaken. But it's not endogenous. It is very much someone that is not the bank decides what the reserve ratio is going to be, and the bank has to just deal with that reserve ratio. I'm going to try and be very, very clear with my language, but I may make mistakes from time to time. It is essential in exams that you are very, very clear with your language. There is a huge difference between a bank and a central bank. A central bank is its own kind of entity which determines monetary policy, which thinks about money supply, and is a central bank. A bank, the kind of thing that you go to when you go to a bank, is a bank, right? They do deposits and loans with individuals and firms, but you can't go to the central bank and borrow money from them. That's just not how the central bank works. Banks go to the central bank and borrow money from them. You don't. So they're different entities that work differently. And so if I make a mistake from time to time, if I call the central bank a bank, I do apologize. In exams, you have to not do that. Okay, questions? Otherwise, questions, concerns? Excellent. So, I've used the word monetary policy a few times today so far, and so I want to talk about what monetary policy actually is. So monetary policy is the attempt by the central bank, usually the central bank, to influence the supply of money or influence the money market in some way. And there's two broad ways that the central bank can influence the money market. They can either fix the amount of currency, or they can fix the price of currency. So what I'm saying here is that the central bank can either say, this year there's going to be this amount of currency that we're going to produce. We're going to produce an extra $200 million worth of currency. We're going to flood the market with that $200 million worth of currency. The money multiplier from the previous slide will take effect, and we'll expand that out to $200 million. But that's the amount of extra currency that's going to go into the economy next year. If you have something like a fiat currency, if you have a currency backed by a commodity, then you're kind of thinking about a fixed amount of currency. If you're going to say that each dollar is worth 1 gram of gold, I have no idea if that's reasonable or not. If you're going to say that each dollar is worth 1 gram of gold, let's say, then the amount of dollars that you have is largely bound by the amount of gold that you have access to. So commodity money or commodity money or currency backed by a commodity, you tend to use this fixing the amount of currency. As the central bank, you decide there's going to be this much new money in the world tomorrow or next year. Which makes a lot of sense, right? This is the way we normally think about money. We naturally, I guess, think about the amount of money. The bank, we think about the central bank prints money and then it uses that money to do stuff, and this is what we go through. So broadly speaking, we're thinking about monetary policy, which fixes the supply of money, right? Money, we have the price of money is the real interest rate, and so we have demand of some sort. And so type 1, we fix the amount of money. I was going to call it a supply curve. We fix the amount of money. And the real interest rate is determined by demand. If demand goes up, then there's no more money to be had, so the only thing that happens when demand for money increases is that the real interest rate increases. Real interest rate increases. And again, as I say, this is fine, and is worked through in the textbook in some detail. The textbook talks at some length about this type of monetary policy. The other type of monetary policy you can have is you can fix the price of currency. So you can go in and you can say, in the money market, right, amount of money, the price of money, there's some demand. In the money market, we're not going to be too concerned about the amount of cash that's floating around out there. What we really care about is the interest rate. Right? As a central bank, we don't really care about the amount of money, we care about the interest rate. We can only do this if we have fiat currencies. Right? It's only available really for fiat currencies. It's kind of okay for things that are commodity-backed. You can't do this for commodity currencies really, but you can kind of do it for commodity-backed ones. It's just a bit fiddly, it's a bit careful. But for fiat currencies, you go in and you say, as the central bank, do I have the next slide? Yes. I'll describe on the next slide how we do this. And so what we do is we say, supply curve is going to look like this. Doesn't matter what the demand for money is, doesn't matter how much demand there is. If demand goes up, the price, the real interest rate is going to stay the same. Or the interest rate at least, the nominal interest rate anyway, is going to stay the same. So if there's more money out there in the economy, then that's fine, as long as the interest rate stays the same. Again, this is what's actually used in Australia. The central bank, as you will have seen, we talk about the central bank having a cash rate. There was a question a little while ago, a few weeks ago, about why hasn't the central bank reduced its cash rate. My answer was, I'm not quite sure, but I'm sure there is a reason. I read an article very recently which says that there's a very strong expectation that the central bank will reduce the cash rate at the next meeting of the central bank, which is quite soon. And there's a very, very strong expectation that the central bank will reduce the cash rate twice this year, 2 times this year. So we should expect to see interest rates falling over the rest of this year. This is surprisingly recent, given my second point, which I haven't said yet, but my second point, which is that this is really just the better way of doing things. In terms of, as a person, if you're trying to keep the economy nice and stable, the amount of money in the economy is not actually that important. We'll talk about this in a few slides. The amount of money in the economy, it's kind of relevant, but it's not that important. The real interest rate is really important. Right? The real interest rate is going to affect real things. It's going to affect the amount of investment that firms do. You really want lots of certainty around the real interest rate. Right? So we can either choose M star or we can choose R star. You really want, as a firm, you want lots of certainty around the real interest rate in order to make your investment decisions. As an individual, you want lots of certainty around the real interest rate so that you know whether it's worth, buying a house or it's worth saving money versus spending money. You don't, as a firm or an individual, really care at all about the total amount of money in the economy. It's just not a relevant factor for you, except to the extent that it might affect the real interest rate. So I want to say that fixing the price of currency doesn't really have that many downsides. And as we'll see on the next slide, it's not that hard to implement when we have a pure fiat currency. Given those facts, it's kind of surprising how recently this happened. This is really like in the 80s and 90s, late 80s, early 90s, worldwide. Right? Australia is one of the earlier countries that does this. In like the mid-80s is when they switched to fixing the real interest rate. It is surprisingly, I'm consistently surprised by how long it took before this system was implemented. Because it seems like to me, it seems like an obviously superior system to fix the interest rate, which we care about, rather than the money supply, which we don't care about. Question? No? Any questions, concerns? Okay. I will talk briefly about open market operations. So, as I say, we do type 2, and the way we do that is through what we call open market operations. And so the government doesn't. There's two ways you could implement this, right? You could go to the banks and say, this is the amount you are required legally to charge, which is not a very good way of doing things. We've talked about price controls and how they tend not to work very well, and this is basically a price control. If you just go to a bank and say, this is the amount you have to charge, then it's largely a price control, which has downsides, right? And banks are going to try and get around this, and it's just not going to go well. So what they do instead is they use what's called open market operations, which is that basically they offer government securities for sale. And those government securities have an implicit interest rate attached to them. They don't actually have an interest rate, they have a different system, but they basically have an implicit interest rate attached to them. So you can go to the central bank, or a bank can go to the central bank, and can borrow money at this interest rate. Right? You can buy government securities that effectively pay this interest rate as the interest rate. And basically the government will buy and sell as many securities as they have to make sure that this interest rate is the one that happens. And so the amount of money in the economy will shrink and grow depending on how many government securities the government buys and sells. Right? When an individual buys a government security, the amount of currency falls. Because that currency that when you go and you buy a government security, you're buying a piece of paper from the government that says the government owes you $100,000 in 2 months' time. Right? The money that you paid to buy that's gone. So when people buy government securities, the amount of money in the economy shrinks. When you sell government securities back to the government, the amount of money in the economy grows. So when the government buys government securities, the amount of money in the economy grows. Yes. So in this way, the government can end up targeting the price because they just buy and sell government securities until the amount of money out there makes this the equilibrium outcome, makes this the actual price of the good. So in certain sense, it's a price ceiling and a price floor at the same time, but it does it through open market operations, through buying and selling securities. This is also why you will never see a government have zero gross debt, because the government really, really wants, or the governmental system as a whole, really needs some people to be holding government securities, right? Because they need to be able to buy back those government securities to affect the interest rate. So government gross debt never goes to zero because the government wants people to be holding government securities so that it has access to those government securities to purchase if it needs them. So gross debt will never be zero. Net debt might be zero. It's not in Australia. But gross debt will never go to zero. And that's not a problem. That's a feature of the system for the government to owe a little bit of money to people. I just say that because there's people... Gross debt is 5%. Like, that's fine. That's completely fine. That's what you'd expect. It would be weird if it was less than that. Yes? So if if there were this much money in the economy, and the government were doing nothing, change colour pen. Right, if there were this much money in the economy and the government does nothing, then the real interest rate is too low. So the way that the government pushes that interest rate up is by reducing that money supply. The way they reduce that money supply is by selling government securities. So they go to you and they say, this is the interest rate that would be implied, but if you buy our securities, we'll give you R star. And so people buy those government securities and get R star, and by doing so, that reduces the amount of money, and so we move up the demand curve to the equilibrium. Oil production. I believe so, but I don't know. I don't know enough about the oil. I don't know enough about how OPEC fixes prices to be able to say for sure. But I suspect that's the case, yes. OPEC is a little bit different because they have to underproduce in order to increase prices, I think. Whereas the government, I mean, it's printing money, I guess, but it's not. It's going to be slightly different. The government doesn't care when it makes more money, when it prints money or removes money from the economy, right? It's not like the government, not like the central bank is made worse off when they have lower profit or higher profit. It's driven by principles of supply and demand, absolutely. This is a demand curve. This is a demand curve for money. This is a supply curve of money. This is an effective supply curve of money. Absolutely. Thanks. Yes? When the government sells security, I want to be very careful with that question. First off, there's a first step of that, which is that money is not GDP. Money is not production. We need to divorce those two ideas. Here we're talking about the amount of cash in the economy. Cash doesn't produce welfare. Cash doesn't produce happiness. Only goods and services produce happiness. When there's more money or less money, we're not talking about when the money supply, when the amount of money in the economy reduces, we're not thinking about real GDP getting smaller. We might be thinking about nominal GDP, maybe, but we're not thinking about real GDP getting smaller. We're just thinking about there being less money in the economy. So that was an issue with the question. But what was the actual question again? To remind me. Right, when the government sells securities, again, it's not really about economic growth. When the government sells a security, then so I'm the government, I sell a security to you, you give me money. There's now less money. So the government sells securities when it wants to reduce the amount of money out there. Because you use money to buy the security. A security, for those that are not, most people are hopefully aware because most of you guys are finance or accounting people. A security is a piece of paper that the government gives you that says they'll pay you a certain amount in the future. It would include, demand from all types, I suppose. There's going to be exchange rate issues. We will talk a little bit about exchange rate stuff tomorrow. Tomorrow we're doing international trade, and we'll talk a little bit about that tomorrow, but we're not going to talk too much about that. It's complicated, is the answer there. Next week, yes. Not tomorrow, because tomorrow is not a lecture. Cash rate, interest rate, cash rate, risk-free interest rate are the same thing. The cash rate is the nominal risk-free interest rate. The cash rate is the nominal risk-free interest rate that the government charges. I think I have the numbers. Cash rate historical. So here we see, just to give you some idea of what the cash rate looks like in a place like Australia. In the 90s, we had high interest rates. The purpose of those high interest rates, partly they were because inflation was very high, but also we had high interest rates because, we won't talk too much about this, but high interest rates allow you to push down inflation. One of the reasons why you might have high interest rates is because you want to get inflation to go lower. So this high interest rate up here is partly to try to push inflation down. This period of relatively high interest rates here are to try to keep inflation under control as the economy bubbles up before what happens here. Anyone, what happens here? Yes, what happened in 2008? Yeah, the Great Recession, the global financial crisis, there's different names for this. One of them is only used in Australia, and I can't remember which one. There's the Great Recession and the global financial crisis. I think global financial crisis is what most people call it, and then Great Recession is apparently like an Australianism that most people don't use, yeah. So global financial crisis. This is global financial crisis. This is the main way that we did two things to deal with global financial crisis. This is one of the big ones, is just massive cuts to interest rates. I mean, this is a huge and very quick cut to interest rates to try to get the economy going again, try to stabilize the economy. Otherwise, you can see various things, right? The economy was overheating a little bit, but then the 2000 recession, not recession in Australia, but recession in America, the 2000 downturn, and so we boost the economy to deal with that. Here we have the 98? I'm not sure why that happened. I'm not sure why this happened. The other thing to note here is that we have a target cash rate in blue, which is what the central bank charges. There's also the interbank rate, which is the rate at which banks trade money between themselves. And you'll see that they are, which is in red here, you'll see they are very similar. They are extraordinarily similar. Right? There is sometimes a tiny difference, but basically we're talking about these things being the same. So the central bank's open market operations tend to work pretty well.
Excuse me, James, you did mention that back in 2008,
yeah.
then was increasingly to lower down inflation, yeah?
In this section, the government's trying to hold inflation low. Not so much to reduce, but trying to hold it low.
So for that specific situation, would type 2 address that? Would type 2 be one of the solutions to lower that inflation? Okay.
They're certainly, for this entire period, we're working in a type 2 model. The entire time.
So lower money, increase rate.
So what we're thinking about here is we're wanting to try to keep inflation down. The economy's overheating. Let's go through a model. Let's go through a model. It'll do. It'll be fine. So we're thinking about here is previously we have R star, S1, D1. Everyone's happy. And then in this period, we start to get overheating. We start to get inflationary pressures. The individuals are starting to think about wanting to borrow more, are starting to want more currency to do stuff with. And so we start to see an increase in demand. No. And so we see an increase in demand. This increase in demand would result in more money in the economy, right, if we do nothing. Right, so this is M1. If we do nothing, we end up at M2. Masses of more currency in the economy, lots of extra cash floating around means we're going to have inflation because there's just lots of extra money flying around. So the prices of things are going to go up because there's more cash. So we have inflation. Inflation pushes down the real interest rate. Right? Yeah? And so inflation pushes down the real interest rate, and so if we do nothing, the real interest rate falls. I don't want to go into this in this much detail. That's okay. If we do nothing, the real interest rate falls because there's more inflation. So we have to increase even just to maintain the same level of real interest, we need to increase the nominal interest rate to deal with the fact that there's inflation. Right, so R star, where we started off, is the nominal interest rate minus the original rate of inflation. I'll use actually I naught. Hopefully that's right. As we have more inflation, we need to push up the nominal interest rate even just to maintain the same real interest rates. If we do nothing, because the central bank, when it releases its cash rate, it releases a nominal cash rate. And so just to stay at the same real interest rate, we're going to have to increase our nominal interest rate. Moreover, we don't actually just want to stay at the real interest rate because we have inflationary pressures. We're worried about inflation here. So actually, we're going to have to increase our nominal interest rate by more than the increase in inflation. So again, this is not the best model for doing this. You want sort of an ASAD model really works best for this, an aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, which we won't get to this course, unfortunately. Shows this really clearly. But basically, if you have inflationary pressures, you need to increase interest rates need to increase nominal interest rates for two reasons. You need to increase nominal interest rates even just to maintain the same real interest rate. You have to increase your nominal rate. Because if inflation goes up and you want this to stay the same, you have to increase the nominal interest rate. But we need to do more than that, because really what we need to do is if inflation's gone higher, we need to push that inflation back down again. Push that inflation back down again, we need to end up at a high real interest rate to push that inflation back down. And so to do that, right, if we want R to increase, right, we've seen inflation increasing. So we need to increase the nominal interest rate a lot, right? We need to increase the nominal interest rate once just to keep the real interest rate constant, and we need to increase nominal interest rates again just to try to actually push down inflation, right? To push that demand for money or amount of money demanded down to a more reasonable level. Again, this is not the best model for this. You want an ASAD model to really show this really clearly. But this is the broad idea. And this is a good point to have to make, though. If we want to increase if we've seen an increase in inflation, and therefore we want to increase the real interest rate to counter that, we need to increase the nominal interest rate by quite a lot, by more than the increase in the inflation rate. More than the increase in the inflation rate. Because we want to see the real interest rate actually go up, not just stay the same. There was a lot there, a lot of me talking. Yes. Yeah. Exactly. If the inflation rate goes up by 0.5%, the only way we're going to get that inflation rate to go back down by 0.5% is by having the real interest rate increase. And so if we only increase the nominal interest rate by 0.5%, then the real interest rate hasn't changed. It's 2 to 3%, yeah. Yeah. Exactly. To reiterate, you're exactly right. Just to reiterate for the room, if the inflation rate numbers came out tomorrow and they said 4%, which would be incredibly surprising, but let's say tomorrow the interest rate was 4%, that's a full percentage point above the target rate. The central bank then, to deal with that, if they were to only increase interest rates by nominal interest by 1%, then nothing's changed. In the real world, nothing's changed. Right? Prices are going up by 1% higher than they should. The nominal interest rate is also 1% higher than it should be. And so the real interest rate hasn't changed. And so the inflation rate is going to stay high, going to stay at that 4%. So in order to push that inflation rate back down, we have to increase real interest rates by more than that 1%. Right? So that real interest rates are unusually high, are high enough to be pushing down the inflation rate. Yes, is the short answer. Yep. In the long run, we can. It depends. We might stay at D2 and just have a higher real interest rate for the short term. It depends. There's lots of things that can go on. We don't have the tools to do. This model does not provide the tools to do a long run analysis. You want an ASAD model, an aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, to be able to do a proper long-run analysis. Yes, in the case of reduced money demand, we would do the opposite thing. We would want to do the opposite. Okay, we're okay for time. Any other questions, quick questions? Issues, cash rate? Yes.
So, why for about just the cash rate, what's the difference between the target cash rate and the interbank rate?
Very little. Formally, definitionally, the difference is that the target cash rate is the central bank releases a press release that says the target cash rate is now 3.5%, and that's what the target cash rate is. That's what it is. So that's why it moves very, very in these little jerks. The interbank cash rate is the price at which banks actually trade money between themselves. So it's the price at which banks actually make the trades between themselves, which clearly can vary a tiny bit from the interbank cash, from the target cash rate, but also clearly doesn't change by very much. Doesn't deviate by very much here. I don't have good reasons for why it would deviate. It should be basically the same all the time, and it is basically the same all the time. This is the only period, and I'm not sure why this is the only period there's any difference, but the difference is minuscule, it's tiny. And since 2003, whenever that is, there's been, you can't even see any instances. There might be a tiny instance there, but I can't see any other instances where there's even the minorest of deviations. So there's a difference in definition, but the numbers should be the same, and they are. Okay. Monetary policy. So as I sort of broadly said here, changes in the cash rate is the main mechanism of the RBA to affect the broader economy. They have a few other little things they can do, but basically they have a big hammer, which is the cash rate. And so if the economy is growing too fast, as we sort of said here, if the economy is growing too fast, the RBA can step in, increase the cash rate, right? By increasing the cash rate, they make it more expensive to, for example, make investments. So since it's more expensive to make investments, people invest less, the economy slows down. It's more expensive to borrow money to pay for things, so people stop borrowing money to, fund consumption. So we increase the cash rate, we slow down the economy. Yeah, as I say, increasing the interest rate discourages borrowing, it decreases prices, and it slows down the economy. Similarly, if the economy is growing too slowly, then we decrease the cash rate to try to pump the economy back up. Because we decrease the cash rate, more people invest, more people borrow money to consume. That's what they're doing here, right? The economy is looking like it's going to go really badly, and so we do massive cuts to the interest rate so that people have an incentive to invest and an incentive to consume. To try to pump the economy back up. Okay, any questions, concerns, issues? Yes? Yeah, so the economy growing too fast it results in inflation, basically. So there's a rate at which the economy can grow in the long run. There's a long run growth rate, so growth that's driven by increases in population and increases in capital accumulation and increases in technology. And sometimes the economy grows faster than that. The nominal economy particularly grows faster than that. And so but when we're growing faster than natural rate of growth, we get inflationary pressures, which we can't really control, and eventually, it's sort of in the short term, having a bear, that's right, no, bull. Which one's the good one? Anyone help me out? Is a bear market good or a bull market? I always forget. Bull market is good, excellent. Having a bull market is great in the short term, but you can only have a bull market for so long before inflationary pressures crash everything. And so the central bank would prefer not to have everything crash down around them. They'd prefer to have a nice, smooth growth rate over the long period. And Australia's done pretty well with that. We've had a pretty smooth growth rate over the long period. Just skipping ahead quickly. Here we go. We'll come to this slide eventually. You can see, particularly since, this is from 86, particularly since about 1990, we've had pretty smooth growth rate, right? Each year there's growth, there's a little bit of GFC there, there's a 2000s recession, or 2000s downturn there, there's the 90s recession here. But overall, we've had, it's been pretty smooth growth over the long run, or over the medium, over this time period at least. Which is what the central bank is trying to achieve, right? You don't want to have 10% growth and then minus 5% growth, and then 15% growth, then minus 10% growth. It makes things difficult when you have these these big booms and busts. Yes, so any questions? Questions, problems? Excellent. So we will talk briefly about inflation. I know we've talked about inflation before, but we're going to think about inflation a bit differently now. Before we talked about sort of how you calculate inflation, and now we want to think about what core underlying causes of inflation, main underlying causes of inflation. So we have a few relationships between GDP growth and inflation. The first one's definitional, right? The growth in nominal GDP. Nominal GDP grows for two reasons. It grows because the real GDP grows, or it grows because prices increase. So we saw this early on. Again, this is an approximation because this really should be something like GDP deflator, but as we saw, they're very, very similar in almost every case. So as I say, real GDP is nominal GDP minus inflation, so nominal GDP is just inflation, inflationary effects together with real GDP effects. These are all growth rates. It's just easier to write down growth. All of these are growth rates. It's all percentage growth rate, percentage. At the same time, the only way that nominal GDP changes, because nominal GDP is just the amount of, is largely the amount of money that's out there. So nominal GDP changes are caused by growth of the money supply. Right? In order to buy something in dollars, you have to have those dollars to buy something. And every dollar is used basically to buy things. And so the growth rate of money supply is going to be very, very closely related to the growth rate of nominal GDP. Totally unrelated to real GDP, but very closely related to the growth rate of nominal GDP. Which brings us to one of our important points, which is that inflation is driven by growth rate of money supply minus the growth rate of real GDP. Again, this is just by using these two equations, these first two together. So inflation is the growth rate of money supply minus the growth rate of real GDP. So inflation is caused by money supply increasing faster than real GDP increases. This is what's causing inflation. This is one of the ways we can think about a cause of inflation, is when there's the money supply going up faster than real GDP. Money supply here is the amount of money, so it's this value. It's the amount of money in the economy. Yes. Yes, we're thinking here about central bank. The central bank largely decides how much money is in the economy. In this situation, about the money supply, if they're spending more money, if they want more money, then the demand will shift out and there'll be more money supply, I guess. So if people want more cash, want more currency, want more money, then we'll have this happen. So you want more money to spend it, basically, on goods, as you say. So yes, but careful. More expenditure means more money supply, yes, is the short answer. But I want to be careful saying that, because we normally think about expenditure in terms of GDP, in terms of real GDP, because we make everything in real terms. More nominal expenditure means more money supply, because every dollar spent has to exist. I don't want to say more money supply. I shouldn't have used the word money supply here, really. I should say, money supply is fine. The amount of money in the economy. If there's more money, the only way people can spend money is that they have it, so you need that money to exist. Yes. If you did actually fix the money supply, you would not have nominal GDP growth. Sorry, yeah, sorry. If you fix the money supply and don't change it, then you'll have no nominal GDP growth. But in the 80s, in the early 80s, and the 70s and 60s, we increased the money supply over time. So you choose how much it is. So what you have in that sort of time period is this is the supply in 1970, and then and this is the demand in 1970, and then the next year you have higher demand and higher supply. Right? So the amount of money is still going to increase because you still print money, you still create cash. You just, each year or each day, really, you're choosing the supply curve. You're choosing a vertical supply curve. Okay. Questions, problems, issues? Lovely. So again, inflation we can kind of control. If we think about controlling the money supply, we can control the money. We can use the money supply, or our controls of the money supply, to affect inflation, right? Because growth of money supply, because inflation is affected directly by the growth of money supply. If we reduce the growth of money supply, then we get less inflation. If we increase the amount of money out there, then we get more inflation. So, some consequences of inflation. Because inflation has consequences, right? There are upsides, there are downsides, there are also what I'm calling neutral consequences, which some people call costs, but I want to be careful. I want to be very specific. So I want to talk about neutral consequences, downsides, upsides. There's lots of instances of inflation. There's lots of things that happen with inflation which cause winners and losers, right? Lots of circumstances where we have high inflation benefit some people at the expense of other people. So if we think about, say, a fixed-rate home loan, if you go to the bank and you've locked in a 10-year deal where you pay 4% every year for 10 years, and then inflation skyrockets, you're very happy, right? Because inflation's 20%, but you're only paying 4% interest on your loan, 4% nominal interest on your loan. So you're ecstatic, right? You're very, very pleased. And the bank is very unhappy. But similarly, if you go in and you lock in a rate, as people did in the late 80s and in the 70s, and you lock in a rate of 16% for 10 years, and then the inflation rate crashes, you're still paying 16% nominal interest, but the inflation rate's only 3 or 4%. You're getting screwed by the bank, right? You're really badly off, but the bank is better off by the same amount. Similarly, so in that instance, there's a winner and a loser. But from an economy-wide perspective, it doesn't really matter. There's no social cost. There's no significant social cost. Similarly, many wage negotiations have fixed increases in wages. So the ANU recently finished its wage negotiation, and most wages increase at 2% per year. If you don't change your job title or your job description at all, then your wage goes up by 2% each year, with one exception, but basically 2% each year. That means if inflation happens to be low, then ANU employees are very, very happy for the next 5 years because we're getting 2% pay increases per year, but inflation's only, as it is at the moment, 1%. So we're very happy. But if inflation were to skyrocket and were to be 20% next year, we're still locked into a 2% increase per year, which is not so good. But again, this is not a social cost. This is a benefit to one party at a cost to another party. The only downsides of these are to do with uncertainty. And so the fact that in Australia we have 2 to 3% inflation pretty much always, maybe dropping a little bit below or a little bit above, means that we kind of don't have these consequences too much because everyone kind of knows what inflation is going to be. Any issues, problems? Yes.
James, just yesterday, Australia's Reserve Bank just made claims that the country will have the lowest ever cash rate of 1.5%.
Oh, did they announce it recently, did they?
Yeah, so just to bring forward understanding,
Yep.
how does that
Oh, yeah.
relate to what we've been talking about?
So the fact that the cash rate's 1.5%, that is very low actually. The fact that the cash rate's 1.5%, they announced it would reduce? Oh, okay, sure. They've announced a reduction. I do apologize. I thought they hadn't yet. They were going to in like 2 weeks. Okay, they're going to, in any case, they will be reducing it. It's not a huge deal, partly because it doesn't necessarily mean we have the lowest real interest rates ever. In these periods here, where we have in a lot of these periods, we have especially out here, the inflation rate is a lot higher. So in this area here, we don't have 3% inflation. Here we're talking about like 15% inflation. So the fact that it's at 1.5% isn't that big a problem because inflation's very low. So it's low, but it's not a huge issue. The major issue with having an interest rate, a nominal interest rate, a nominal cash rate of something as low as 1.5% is that if we have another crash the size of the GFC, then we're screwed. Right? Because part of the reason we were able to do the GFC quite well is that we collapsed the cash rate from, 7.5% down to like 3.5%. So we were able to collapse the cash rate by like 4 percentage points. And if our cash rate's only 1.5%, then we can't do that. So the big downside of having only 1.5% interest rates, cash rates, is that we don't have the capacity to reduce it by lots if we need to. So we have to just sort of hope that there's not a major, major world recession in the next little while. Which seems like a interesting hope at this point, but that's okay. So it's not a big deal. It's like, they talk about debt is the highest it's ever been. Of course that's the highest it's ever been. The economy is the largest it's ever been. It's not surprising in any country that debt is currently the highest it's ever been. It's like saying population is currently the highest it's ever been. Yes, it's true. It's just not interesting. So it's not a big problem, except if we have a massive negative hit to the economy in the next couple of years. So, okay. Questions? Otherwise? Inflation, consequences. Negative consequences, the downsides of inflation. Because there are a couple of downsides. The first and third are the big ones. The second one I've put in there because it is kind of there as well, so I want to talk about it. The second one's almost a neutral consequence, but it is there. First one is menu costs. Menu costs are the main, what we think of as the main cost of inflation, or one of the main costs of inflation. Menu costs are the fact that it takes time and energy to change prices of things. This is not as much of a problem as it used to be, but it is still a problem, which is that if the inflation is 10%, or particularly if inflation is not what we expect it to be, if we expect inflation of 2% and we put up all our prices by 2%, it costs us money to put up all our prices by 2%. If inflation is then actually 10%, then all our prices are wrong. Yeah? We expected our prices to have to go up 2%, but actually they've gone up 10%. They should have gone up 10%, so we have terrible prices, and we have to pay again to change all those prices again, to work out the optimal pricing structures, to set up the whole system again. So menu costs are the cost of changing the prices of things, changing the menu, basically. Again, it's not as much of an issue as it used to be because, especially if you think about, say, supermarkets and menu costs in supermarkets, this used to be a huge problem because you would literally have to go and put little stickers on every single thing. This is the kind of thing we're talking about, right? This is part of what we're talking about. You literally have to go and put little stickers on every single item. You don't have to do that anymore. Now you just change it in the background system, so it's much easier, but there's still costs associated with this, with changing the pricing structures. The third one is also quite important. It's an indirect one. It's not one I've thought about before, but it's in the textbook, and I quite liked it. I think it's in the textbook, and I quite liked it, which is that if you have significant, and it's relevant today, if you have significant inflation, then it can encourage the government to put in place price controls. Right? So we see this this was a problem in Venezuela recently, where there was high inflation, which caused voter anger, which caused citizen anger, I should say, really, which caused citizen anger. Previously we used to pay $1 for a loaf of bread, and now it costs $5 for a loaf of bread, and I can't possibly afford this. Yes, but your wages have also gone up by 5 times, so it's not that big a deal. But Now I feel like I can't afford it because it used to cost $1 and now it costs $5. This is terrible. And so the government steps in and says, we're going to put in a price control and we're going to cap the price of bread at $2 per loaf. And as we talked about in the first half of the course, price controls tend to cause deadweight loss, we tend to cause shortages. And so one negative consequence of inflation is that because citizens don't like the fact that their prices are increasing, they force the government or encourage the government to introduce price controls which cause social costs, which have associated social costs. So this is voter anger leading to price controls. Another one is, which I've, again, not really thought that much about before, is it increases the tax, what we call increases the tax burden on savings. Again, I'm not too worried about this because this is kind of a neutral one almost, but it does change your incentive structures. The idea here is that when inflation is low and nominal interest rates are low, you make a relatively small amount of money when you have your savings in the bank make a relatively small amount of money. And so when you're taxed on that earnings, it doesn't matter too much. Right? The numbers that I've seen some numbers used. I should have used numbers. Oh well. And so you're taxed a relatively small amount on that. So we talk about the real rate is 4%, but we have different inflation rates. Let's make big numbers. Then we have nominal rates. Right, we have nominal rates here. So this is economy 1, economy 2. So if we have $100 in savings, let us say, so we have $100 in savings, $100 to begin with, becomes $104. Here it becomes $112. In nominal terms. We still have a 4% real increase, roughly 4% real increase, but the nominal terms are different. The problem is we then pay tax. We pay tax on the earnings, on the capital gains. And so here we pay $1 in tax. Here we pay $3 in tax. So really, after tax, here we have $103, and here we have $109. And so our real rate of return importantly, well, here we went from $100 to $103, and so we have a real rate of, and there's 0% interest, so we went nominally from 100 to 103, and there's no interest, and there's no inflation, and there's no inflation, and so we made $3. So our real rate of return is 3%. Here, we went from $100 to $109 nominally, but there's an 8% inflation rate. So actually, we only have a 1% real rate of return. So we need to be careful with inflation, right? One effect of inflation is that it changes the tax burden on savings. Something to be aware of, something to be careful of when you have big changes in inflation. I do, again, want to focus on this. It's mostly what I'm thinking of more as a neutral consequence, but it's usually classed as a negative. Is that better? It's done now. Any questions? Questions, comments? Negative consequences of inflation? Yes, there are some others as well. The real interest rate is the same in each of these cases. Yes. One-to-one. Oh, sure. So if we were thinking about, this is a different question, this is a somewhat different question. If we were thinking about this economy and thinking 8% inflation is too high, and we want to push that down, again, I don't want to focus on it. No. My answer is, if we want to push down inflation, we need to increase real interest rates. The amount by which you do that depends on the modeling that you use, and it's really outside the scope of this course. You use the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model to work it out. So it's beyond the scope of this course, unfortunately. Broadly speaking, the more you increase the real interest rate, the more inflation will fall. And so, but it'll have other costs. So it's similar to what we talked about a few weeks ago with the Solo Swan model, of a matter of if you have a fall in capital, then actually no, I shouldn't say this because this is the exam question. This is the problem set question. So never mind. We didn't talk about it because it's the problem set question. But it's the same. It's the same sort of issue. Is that you have a trade-off you have to make. You can either increase interest rates by a huge amount and get back to your ideal inflation really, really fast, but you have to deal with that really high inflation for a little while, that really high interest rate, for a little while, which is really costly because you restrict investment, you restrict consumption. Or you can increase the real interest rate by a little bit, and it's only a little bit costly, but it's a little bit costly for a long time, because it takes a long time then for the inflation rate to fall back down to the ideal level. Okay, positive consequences, because if this was all there was, then we would never have inflation because the government would just push it to zero. Positive consequences. First off, one of the reasons why particularly we used to have inflation when central banks are not independent is that they get government revenue. Particularly when the government controls the money supply, they can print money and then they can use that money to buy stuff. And so it's government revenue. So this is the printing money argument. The other argument that's actually useful for us is that it helps with the downward wage rigidity problem, which we will come to in a little bit. So it helps with what we call the downward wage rigidity problem, which we talked about before, right? Is that workers really don't like to have their nominal wages be reduced. And so having inflation allows us to have real wages fall without actually reducing the nominal wages, which has benefits. And we'll see some modelling of that in a bit. How much have we got? Okay. Questions on consequences of inflation otherwise? Quickly. Yes? No, we'll come to it. We'll come to it later. It doesn't get rid of it completely. It just helps. It potentially helps. Okay. I want to talk briefly about the classical dichotomy, and then we'll get on to short-run fluctuations. So economic variables, we tend to divide into two parts, and we've tried to be reasonably clear with doing this. We divide it into nominal variables and real variables. So nominal variables are the ones that are measured in dollars. Real variables are the ones that are measured in what we call constant units. So they might be measured in the year 2000 or 2010 US dollars, or bushels of wheat, or whatever it is that you're measuring things in a constant unit. The classical dichotomy says that there's very different forces that influence the real economy versus that which influences the nominal economy. And that anything that you do in the nominal economy isn't going to have any significant impact, or any impact at all, actually, on the real economy, and to a certain extent, vice versa. So we call this monetary neutrality. This is this idea that if we double the money supply tomorrow, all that'll happen is that all prices and all wages will double tomorrow, and nothing else will happen. Right? Nothing will happen otherwise. Just that prices will double, wages will double, which is a type of price, and no one will care. Suddenly money will be worth half as much as it was previously. The end. This is a tricky question as to whether it's true or not. I want to argue that typically, I say tends to, good, I do say something here, I do cover myself a little bit. This tends to be true in the long run. In the long run, the amount of the nominal variables tend to not really matter. This is why the fact that Japanese GDP is 100, not 100, Japanese GDP per capita is 100 times that of Australia. Yeah? Because they measure their GDP in yen and not in dollars. Right? The fact that their prices and wages are 100 times ours doesn't mean anything because it's just a number. The production per person is still largely the same. So we're true in the long run. There are short-run effects. Nonetheless, there are short-run effects, some of which we talked about before. Right? We talk about things like menu costs and voter anger. And there are other short-run effects. To bring prices down, you need to do bad things to the real economy. To bring prices up, you need to do good things to the real economy. as a central bank. We need to boost the real economy by lowering real interest rates. And so in the short run, this tends to be false. Because we have inflation expectations, because we have downward wage rigidity, because prices don't update immediately, so that's to say we have inflation expectations, which might be different from the realized inflation. So for a range of reasons, there might be short-run costs, might be short-run reasons why the classical dichotomy fails. But in the long run, it doesn't really. In the long run, everything's basically fine. Or money doesn't really matter in the long run. Only technology matters in the long run. Questions, problems before we do short-run fluctuations, and then do not talk about the mid-semester exam, I suspect. Excellent. Short-run fluctuations. So everything we've done so far, we've been working under this. We've had in the back of our mind, maybe a little bit, that the economy fluctuates over time, but we've also had this idea that the economy grows steadily. Certainly our Solow Swan model was exclusively a model of steady growth. The economy grew steadily over time, going towards its peak, going towards its optimum, and then once it got there, it stayed at the steady state. But economic growth is rarely growing at a steady rate per year. We tend to get short-run changes in the growth rate, so we call these economic fluctuations or business cycles. We have a recession, which is when our real GDP falls for 2 consecutive quarters. We call that a recession. And generally speaking, in the modern society at least, expansion occurs between these recessions. Again, economic expansion is a relatively modern phenomenon, only for about the last 200 years or so. Prior to that, there wasn't this economic expansion between recessions. There was just, you just sort of had a good level, and then a recession, and then a good level, and then a recession. Now it's growth, recession, growth, recession. As we can see here, right, real GDP growth rate, we saw this one earlier, and we can see the per quarter level in blue and the annual level in red. So the annual level is just the sum of the 4 quarters. That's why it's higher. And we see that we have the occasional recession. We have a recession here. We almost have a recession here. We almost have a recession here, but not quite. But we have then growth outside of those periods. Outside of these periods of downturns or recessions, we have growth, economic expansion. Oh, sorry, the other thing I want to mention is that it's not a steady state. It's not a steady rate. It's not like we grow every quarter by 0.5%, right? It's that we grow by 3% and then by 0.5 and then by 1.5 and then by a little bit less, and then up and down and up and down and up and down and up and down and up and down, over and over and over again, right? So there's fluctuations here as well. There's short fluctuations and there's the bigger fluctuations. There's the 2000s downturn. There's the Great Recession downturn. There's the 90s recession. So there's a few different things. There's a few different recessions and economic expansions going on here, but it's not smooth. It's not just 2.5 or 0.5% every quarter. It's up and down and up and down. This is just GDP. This is not per capita, which is why it's larger than you would think otherwise. This is just GDP. It's real GDP, but it's just GDP. Questions, issues? Cool. So, a couple of key properties of economic fluctuations that mean that we care, which is basically why we care. Why do we care about recessions? The first one's probably the most important, which is that lots of different macroeconomic variables tend to move in the same direction. Right? When we see increases in consumption, we tend to also see increases in investment. When we see falls in consumption, we tend to also see falls in investment. When we see increases in employment, we tend to also see increases in GDP. When we see falls in GDP, we tend to also see falls in employment. So we care about if we care about employment, then we should also care about GDP, because they tend to move together. Everything tends to move in the same direction. Another key property of these fluctuations, so point number 1 is why we should care. Point number 2 is, despite the fact that we care, there's not a whole lot we can do, because it's really hard to predict future fluctuations. It can be really hard to predict future fluctuations. It's hard to predict when a recession is going to happen, and it's hard to predict how long a recession will last. it's not necessarily that hard to predict that a recession's going to happen, but it's hard to predict when it's going to happen. As in, I would say there's a pretty good chance there's going to be a recession in the next 4 to 5 years. I would be very surprised if Australia did not experience a recession in the next 4 to 5 years. I could be wrong, but I'd be very surprised. But if you ask me, will it have a recession will it enter recession in the next 1 month? I have no idea. In the next 2 months, I have no idea. In the next 6 months, I have no idea. Right? I don't know when this is going to happen, but I would be very surprised if it didn't happen at some point in the next 4 to 5 years. I would have said, no, in the next 4 to 5 years. And similarly for America, right? There's enough stuff going on, there's enough things going wrong in the way these economies are progressing that makes me very, very suspicious that there will be a recession in the next couple of years. But that said, 3 years ago, I said I'm pretty sure there's going to be a recession in the next 3 years, and I was wrong. So I could easily be wrong again. Similarly, it's hard to tell how long the recession will last. It's hard to tell whether we're going to be in a recession like the GFC, and it's going to be devastating and last for ages, or it's going to be a recession like the 2000s downturn, which was not great, but pretty short-lived. There's also persistence. So this is saying that when we're in a recession, we tend to stay with low growth for a little while. When we're going well, we tend to stay going well for a little while. And changes tend to happen relatively quickly and suddenly. We tend to suddenly go off the cliff into a recession. So things persist and then change quickly, especially entering recessions. Once we're in a recession, we tend to have low growth for a little while, and then we pick up really nicely. Concerns, problems? I have a lot of time for concerns, but okay, cool. Quick warning, problem set 2. The modelling we're about to do gives another way of approaching one of the questions for problem set 2. I encourage you not to use this model because you don't have to. It's beyond the scope of what is required in problem set 2. We just barely missed out on the timing. Ideally, problem set 2 would be due before this talk, but it isn't. So we manage. So why do recessions occur? We have a few different explanations for why, rather a few potential explanations for why recessions occur have been proposed. I'm going to focus on the first two. There's also the monetarist theory, but I'm not going to, which the textbook talks about a little bit. If you want to have a look at the textbook for the monetarist theory part, feel free, but I'm not going to talk about it here today. I would argue the main one is, the main one, that's true, is the Keynesian idea. And in the Keynesian model, the recessions are what we call a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so the idea here is that there's a little bit of pessimism, and that little bit of pessimism spirals out into a recession. So consumers and firms begin to think that GDP growth might be about to shrink, right? The economy might be starting to slow down. And because they think that the economy might be about to slow down, firms start to invest less because they expect to have less production in the future. Individuals start to buy less because they expect to have savings in the future to get them through the recession, get them through the downturn that's about to happen, the little downturn that's about to happen. But because there's lower consumption, there's lower revenue for firms, and so the firms have to invest even less. Because the firms are spending less, they have less capital, so they demand less labor, which means they have less labor demand, so there's less employment, which drives down wages, which reduces consumer spending, which means there's less spending, which means that there's less investment, which means that there's less wages, which means that there's less spending, which means that there's less... You can see how where I'm going with here, right? So we get a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? We get cascading pessimism. We start off with a couple of people thinking things are not going to go so well, and because of that, we get this self-fulfilling prophecy, this cascade of everyone thinking everything is going to go terribly, and GDP goes down dramatically. So we get a cascading effect of pessimism, pushing GDP way, way down. It's not great. It's not great. I don't have anything to help you here. It's just a bad thing to have happen. This is part of why we talk about the central bank trying to keep everyone happy. Right? We're trying to keep people from thinking that the economy is going to shrink, because if people think the economy is going to shrink, then that will happen. If people think the economy is not going to shrink, then that also will happen, according to this broad Keynesian model. Yep. If everyone's being optimistic and positive, we would not expect to see recessions. Because everyone's being optimistic and positive. There's no reason why firms and consumers think that everything is going to go terribly, so it doesn't. There are other theories. We can talk about real business cycle theories. So there are other potential reasons, right? There are other reasons like this real business cycle model. And this does actually give us a reason for a recession that I can talk about. So real business cycle theory says that technological progress is the thing that drives economic growth. And so technological progress leads to increasing marginal product of labor, which increases the demand for labor, which increases employment and wages, increases in employment and wages, drive increases in income, consumption, therefore more investment, therefore more wages, and we get good things happening. All this increases GDP. The flip side of this says that if something causes a reduction in technology, then we're going to get that same spiraling happen. We're going to get that a reduction in technology causes a small hit to labor productivity. That small hit to labor productivity means that we hire less workers, which means there's less wages, which means there's less consumption, which means we hire less workers, which means there's less wages, less consumption, and so on. Now, reductions in technology are a tricky thing to have, right? Because in our modern world, we don't really have reductions in what we think of as technology. So you have to go not outside the bounds of the model, but you have to really stretch the model. And so we can talk about the oil shock. So oil is a major input. Oil is still, but certainly was a major input into everything. And so when oil went from being super cheap in the early 70s, or 1970, to being quite expensive in the OPEC issue, as was mentioned earlier, due to OPEC raising its prices, you can describe this as a fall in technology. There are other ways you can describe this, but you can describe this as a fall in technology, because it's not a fall in capital, and it's not a fall in labor, but it is a massive fall in the amount that the economy can produce. And the only things that we have, right, because we have our model, which goes y equals a k to the third, h to the 2/3. If it's not affecting capital and it's not affecting labor, but it is affecting output, then it must be a technology shock. And so the oil price shock we model as a technology shock here. Okay. Any questions, problems, issues? Beaut. Modeling recessions. So we want to do a little bit of modeling, and to model our recession, we're going to now combine two of our previous models, something we've not done very much of before. We're going to take two of our previous models and look at how recessions are going to look like in two of our previous models. So we have our labor market, and we have our Solow-Swan model, right? Amount of labor, wage rate of labor, amount of. This is going to be a modified. Well, no, we'll come to it. So we have labor market, right? We have demand for labor. Demand for labor. We have supply of labor. We have a wage rate. I've drawn this poorly, but we'll see how we go. Suppose some shock reduces the demand for labor. The effect of reducing the demand for labor, demand for labor shifts down to D1. If nothing else happens, this is fine. Demand for labor shifts to D1. Amount of labor in the economy falls, W falls. Wage rate falls. Lower employment means that we have reduced output in the economy, right? Because if we reduce L, or capital H, because recall, if we have less workers, less labor, then we have less output. So I'm going to draw a modified Solow-Swan. I'm going to draw this diagram, but on so I'm drawing it as labor against output. In our previous models, we've had capital against output. Here we're thinking about capital being fixed and labor changing over time and changing with time. And so we go from having L naught and producing Y naught. After the shock, we have L1, we produce Y1, and the economy has shrunk. right? Our output, our GDP has gone down because we have less workers. Less workers working because our workers are less efficient, so we hire less of them. Let's just try and get this just right. Ugh. There we go. Questions, concerns? Yep. Next point. So there's 2 points. Oh, yes. 2 points. So next point is, but moreover, we're often going to have downward wage rigidity, right? Our consumers don't want to have their wage reduced below W star. So if we have downward wage rigidity, then it's even worse. Because with downward wage rigidity, we don't go to L1, we drop down to L2 instead, because firms are forced to pay L2 instead. And so we get even worse. So we do even worse than it would be caused just from the reduction in demand. Ideally, wages would fall a little bit, employment would fall a little bit, output would fall a little bit, but instead, wages stay the same, labour falls by quite a lot, output falls by quite a lot. So downward wage rigidity makes things even worse. In addition, especially according to the Keynesian models, but also to a lesser extent in the real business cycle models, there are feedback loops which make this fall in demand even worse. There's an initial fall in demand, but on top of that, the demand falls again because people are pessimistic. People think that demand is going to keep falling. And so in addition, it's not that we move from D to D1, but we might even move from D to... Right now, labour model, supply, we have initial demand level, initial wages. We have fixed wage, well, let's say we have fixed wages. Let's just do the model with fixed wages. Instead of moving to D1, which is the initial shock, we actually move to D2, right, which is the shock after these various multipliers, these Keynesian multipliers, act on the economy. And so we actually move, in terms of output, it's even worse because we go from L0, Y0, with multipliers and with downward wage rigidity, we end up at, let's say, L prime. Y prime. We end up much, much worse off in terms of output. So we have two additional effects that are driving everything to be even worse. We have downward wage rigidity, making things even worse, and we have these multipliers, these pessimism multipliers, making things even worse. Right? Because we think of, if we move from D to D1, which is our actual shock to demand, that would reduce output. But if there's reduced output, then there's again reduced demand for labour because there's less goods being produced, there's less demand for labour, which reduces demand for labour again. So we get flow-on effects, right? We don't just have a small reduction, we instead have a big reduction. It's very, very bad. Okay, any questions? So this is recessions, right? We have a small shock, D to D1, but instead of having a little hit to Y, because we have multipliers, because we have downward wage rigidity, we end up much, much worse off. Any questions? Questions, comments, concerns? Quick ones. Cool. We can talk about, so then we talk about how we deal with this. So what we talked about here, the modelling I've done here is really sort of short-run modelling. Short-run is, over a few quarters or 1 quarter is the short run for monetary policy. We divide monetary policy time periods into 3 broad categories: short run, medium run, and long run. Short run is when the government doesn't step in. Medium run is how the government steps in and how the automatic various government and private stabilisers step in to start fixing the problem. And in the long run, we get back to our equilibrium, our initial steady state. In the long run, there are no fluctuations. So we talked about the short run. Now we think about what happens in the medium run, how the government might step in and try and do, or how the government and the private sector might step in and try and fix something here. From the government's perspective, we want to think about monetary policy and fiscal policy. So from a monetary policy perspective, the economy's tanked. We want to prime the economy again. We're going to lower interest rates. We're going to push those interest rates down, again, as was done in... I have to go way, way back. Whoops, shouldn't have done this. As was done in the GFC, right? We have to push, we have a recession coming, so we massively lower interest rates to try to pump the economy. Right, lower interest rates encourage investment, more capital increases the marginal product of labour, and so we get increasing labour demand. At the same time, we get increasing labour demand. So the effect, one of the effects here is we might push labour demand back to the right a little bit. Let's just do another quick labour market diagram. So we had the initial demand, we had demand after the various modifiers, and we have supply. And we have supply, and we have the wage rate. So we have a few things happen. When we pump the market full of money, or full of cheap capital, we increase the demand for labour up to D3, let's say, so we get a nice increase in the demand for labour. At the same time, those lower interest rates encourage inflation, which is going to have two effects. It's going to increase the demand, it's going to push the demand up again, it's going to push the demand up as well, right, from this increasing, because wages are cheaper now, because money is less valuable. But also, we're going to push that supply of labour curve is also going to get pushed up. So this is as I say, talking about dealing with that downward wage rigidity problem, is if we push if we push inflation up, then effective wages, which are real wages, get pushed down. So the ultimate effect is that you have to pay, is that the supply curve gets pushed up. And so maybe the supply curve goes up a little bit, in which case it doesn't matter. If we have a small increase in supply, then it doesn't matter. We're still bound by the rigid wages, and so no one cares. But maybe we have a large increase in inflation, and we get up to I'm going to call it S3, and maybe we move away from our downward wage rigidity problem. So we could potentially, with enough inflation, get out of that downward wage rigidity problem as well. So inflation here helps us out. On the other side, we can do fiscal policy, so we can cut taxes, increase spending. There's two ways that happens. One is the automatic stabilizers. So automatic stabilizers are things like unemployment benefits and differences in and progressive taxation. When people lose their jobs, then the government starts pumping money into the economy through transfers, right? Because they start paying more unemployment benefits. They don't have to do anything, they automatically start doing that. So this increases demand for goods, which increases demand for labour. When people lose their jobs, the tax rates go down, right? Well, if they were to take pay cuts, then their tax rates go down, and so the automatic stabilizers kick in. But the main one here we're thinking about is going to be unemployment benefits, right? We're now paying more money out in unemployment benefits. Those people then have to use that money to buy goods and services. And again, independently of the automatic stabilizers, the government could also just increase spending. So we saw this a little bit during the GFC. It's actually not a little bit. We saw this quite a lot during the GFC, in that the government stepped in as a fiscal policy measure, and in Australia spent a lot of money. Right? They put a lot of investment into the economy. They built a lot of schools. They put in a lot of insulation. They did a lot of good works, or a lot of expensive works. Finally, because we're on the last slide almost. We're out of time. The market forces is also going to be important here. As the banking system gets used to the recession, figures out what's going on, they're going to start to recover, reopen access to credit for firms who can then make investment, start making investment again. Technological development just happens gradually over time, so it pushes labour demand back up. Inventories, and the other one is a slightly strange one, which is that in the start of the recession, the firms can fire all their workers and just burn through inventory. But after a certain amount of time, there's no inventory left. They can just sell their inventories off. After a certain amount of time, there's no inventories left, and so they have to hire more workers to refill those inventories again, because they no longer have stockpiles of goods to sell. They have to start making new ones again. As I say, as I've sort of drawn already here, overall we get